The morning of June 11th, 1944, began like so many others along the Gustav Line in central Italy. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring stood in his command post near Frascati, studying reconnaissance reports that had arrived before dawn. But one particular assessment made him pause. American P-47 Thunderbolts, the reports indicated, were now carrying bomb loads exceeding 2,500 pounds on ground attack missions, yet they maintained speeds that allowed them to evade German fighters with apparent ease. Kesselring, who had commanded the Luftwaffe before taking charge of German forces in Italy, understood immediately what this meant. It wasn't just a tactical adjustment. It was evidence of something far more troubling, a fundamental miscalculation about American industrial philosophy that had shaped German military thinking since the beginning of the war. For nearly 5 years, German military doctrine had been built on a clear principle. Specialization produced superiority. Fighter aircraft fought other aircraft. Bombers dropped bombs. Reconnaissance planes gathered intelligence. Each machine, each unit, each soldier was trained and equipped for a specific role within a larger system. This belief wasn't arbitrary. It had worked brilliantly during the invasions of Poland, France, and the Low Countries. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter had swept Allied aircraft from the skies. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber had delivered precision strikes against ground targets. The Wehrmacht's combined arms doctrine, where specialized units worked in carefully coordinated operations, had produced victories that stunned the world. By the time German forces invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, this philosophy seemed validated by an unbroken string of military successes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Kesselring himself embodied this doctrine. Born in 1885 in Marktsteft, Bavaria, he had started his military career in the artillery before transitioning to the Luftwaffe in the 1930s. He was not a pilot, but an administrator and strategist who understood air power as a system of interconnected specialized parts. When he commanded Luftflotte II during the Battle of Britain in 1940, he had directed German bomber formations with fighter escorts, each type of aircraft performing its designated function. When the Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority over Britain, Kesselring and other German commanders attributed the failure not to their doctrine, but to insufficient numbers and the unexpected resilience of British radar systems. By 1943, when Kesselring assumed command of German forces in Italy, the strategic situation had deteriorated significantly. The Allies had landed in Sicily in July, and by September they had crossed onto the Italian mainland. Kesselring's task was to conduct a fighting withdrawal, delaying the Allied advance while preserving German forces for the defense of the Reich itself. He had chosen his defensive positions with characteristic skill. The Gustav Line, anchored by the fortress monastery of Monte Cassino, exploited Italy's mountainous terrain to create a barrier that would cost the Allies dearly. But Kesselring faced a problem that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve. The Allies controlled the skies. The American air forces that arrived in Italy during late 1943 and early 1944 operated with a freedom that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. German fighter strength in Italy had been steadily depleted by the demands of defending the Reich against the combined bomber offensive. Kesselring's Luftwaffe forces in theatre consisted of perhaps 200 operational aircraft, scattered across dozens of bases and constantly under attack from Allied bombers. Against this diminished force, the United States Army Air Forces could deploy thousands of aircraft from bases in southern Italy, Corsica, and North Africa. Among these aircraft, one type began to appear with increasing frequency over the battlefields of central Italy in the spring of 1944, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47 had entered service with the United States Army Air Forces in late 1942. It was, by any measure, an enormous aircraft for a single-seat fighter. Empty, it weighed approximately 10,000 pounds, nearly twice the weight of a Messerschmitt Bf-109. Fully loaded, it could exceed 17,000 pounds. This mass was necessary to accommodate its power plant, a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower. The engine was so large that Republic's designers had been forced to design the fuselage around it, creating the P-47's distinctive bulky appearance that earned it nicknames like Jug and Thunderbolt. German intelligence officers, studying photographs and gun camera footage of the P-47 from 1943, had initially dismissed it as a curiosity. Yes, it was fast at high altitude, capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. Yes, it was rugged, with armor plating protecting the pilot and crucial systems. But it was also heavy and, when compared to the lightweight fighters like the Bf-109 or the Focke-Wulf Fv-190, less maneuverable in dogfights. The German assessment, shared widely among Luftwaffe commanders including Kesselring, was that the P-47 represented American industrial excess, building aircraft that were bigger and more powerful than necessary, consuming resources that could have produced 2 or 3 lighter, more efficient fighters. This assessment seemed to make sense within the framework of German military thinking. German aircraft designers had consistently prioritized performance over payload. The Bf-109 could carry a single centerline bomb of up to 500 pounds, but doing so drastically reduced its speed and maneuverability, rendering it vulnerable to Allied fighters. The preferred German approach was to use dedicated ground attack aircraft like the Junkers Ju-87 or the Henschel HS-129. These aircraft carried respectable bomb loads, but they were slow and required fighter escort to survive in contested airspace. The system worked, German planners believed, because each type of aircraft did what it was designed to do. But the P-47 pilots arriving in Italy in the spring of 1944 were discovering something that German intelligence had failed to predict. The Thunderbolt's massive engine and robust airframe meant that it could carry external stores, bombs, and rockets on underwing and fuselage pylons, without the catastrophic performance degradation that plagued other fighter bombers. A P-47, loaded with 2 1,000-pound bombs and a 500-pound bomb on the centerline, a total payload of 2,500 pounds, still retained enough speed and power to escape if German fighters appeared. More importantly, it could fight back. The key to this capability lay in the P-47's design philosophy. Where German designers had sought to minimize weight to maximize performance, Republic Aviation's engineers had built an aircraft around raw power. The R-2800 engine didn't just overcome the P-47's weight, it overwhelmed it. Even with 2.5 tons of bombs slung beneath its wings, the Thunderbolt could accelerate away from danger, climb to altitude, and if necessary, jettison its external stores and engage in air-to-air combat with German fighters on roughly equal terms. This meant that a single P-47 pilot could perform the mission of both a fighter and a bomber, without requiring dedicated escort aircraft or sacrificing survivability. The implications of this capability began to manifest over the skies of Italy in the late spring and early summer of 1944. American tactical air forces, organized under the 12th Air Force and later consolidated into the Mediterranean Allied Tactical Air Force, began to employ P-47 Thunderbolts in what they called fighter bomber missions. Groups of 8 to 12 P-47 seconds would take off from bases near Naples or Foggia, each aircraft loaded with bombs, rockets, and a full ammunition load for its 850 caliber machine guns. They would fly north toward the German defensive lines, often at low altitude to avoid radar detection. When they located a target, supply convoy, artillery position, troop concentration, command post, they would attack with devastating effect. German ground forces had faced air attacks before. The Luftwaffe's own ground attack units had perfected close air support tactics during the campaigns in Poland and France. But those attacks had come from dedicated ground attack aircraft, often slow enough for ground gunners to track and engage. The P-47 attacks were different. The Thunderbolts would appear suddenly, diving from several thousand feet at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. They would release their bombs, often from altitudes as low as 1,000 feet, then pull up and circle to strafe ground targets with their machine guns. If German fighters scrambled to intercept, the P-47 seconds could jettison any remaining external stores and either fight or flee, depending on the tactical situation. If no fighters appeared, they would continue attacking until their ammunition was exhausted. The material impact on German operations was significant. Kesselring's defensive strategy in Italy depended on a constant flow of supplies from the north. Ammunition, food, fuel, replacement equipment, and reinforcements. These supplies travelled south along a limited number of roads and rail lines, all of which were vulnerable to air attack. Throughout the spring of 1944, American P-47 seconds systematically destroyed bridges, cratered roads, demolished rail yards, and attacked supply convoys. The German logistics system, already strained by the demands of multiple fronts, began to break down. Artillery batteries rationed their ammunition. Panzer units, immobilized by fuel shortages, were dug in as static pillboxes. Infantry divisions received only a fraction of their required rations. But the material impact, severe as it was, represented only part of the problem Kesselring faced. The psychological impact on German forces was perhaps even more corrosive. German soldiers throughout the war had been taught that they served the most technologically advanced military in the world. German engineering, German precision, German innovation. These were the qualities that, combined with superior training and fighting spirit, would ensure victory even against numerically superior enemies. The propaganda that German soldiers absorbed from newsreels, radio broadcasts, and official publications consistently reinforced this message. Germany possessed wonder weapons, aircraft and tanks and submarines that were qualitatively superior to anything the Allies could produce. The reality that German soldiers in Italy encountered daily contradicted this narrative in ways both large and small. They observed that American soldiers were issued chocolate bars and cigarettes as standard rations, while German troops subsisted on black bread and ersatz coffee. They noted that American artillery seemed to possess unlimited ammunition, firing preparation barrages that lasted for hours, while German batteries were restricted to a handful of shells per day. They saw that American trucks were so abundant that the Allies could afford to abandon damaged vehicles by the roadside rather than towing them back for repair. And increasingly, they watched the skies as American aircraft, particularly the P-47 Thunderbolts, operated with virtual impunity. The psychological impact of air supremacy cannot be overstated. Soldiers who spend their days hiding in foxholes or cellars, emerging only at night to move supplies or rotate positions, develop a profound sense of vulnerability and helplessness. They understand, with a clarity that no amount of propaganda can obscure, that the enemy can see them and strike them at will, while they can do almost nothing in return. German soldiers in Italy gave the Allied aircraft sardonic nicknames. They called the P-47 seconds Jabos, short for jagged bomber or fighter bomber, a term that carried connotations of both fear and resentful admiration. Some German troops reportedly referred to any Allied fighter bomber, regardless of type, as a Thunderbolt, a linguistic concession that revealed which aircraft they feared most. Kesselring received reports of these morale problems from his subordinate commanders throughout the spring and summer of 1944. But he faced a dilemma that no tactical skill could resolve. He could not contest Allied air superiority with the limited fighter forces available to him. His pilots were skilled and motivated, but they were outnumbered by ratios that sometimes exceeded 10-1. Even when they managed to intercept Allied formations, they discovered that the P-47 seconds were formidable opponents. The Thunderbolt could absorb tremendous battle damage and remain airborne. Its 8 machine guns delivered withering firepower. And its high-speed performance meant that a P-47 pilot who wanted to disengage could simply dive away, using gravity and that massive engine to build speed that German fighters could not match. The strategic reports that reached Kesselring's headquarters in early June 1944 contained information that forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. American P-47 pilots were not simply dropping bombs and fleeing. They were conducting sustained ground attack missions that lasted for hours, returning to their targets multiple times in a single day, and doing so while maintaining the capability to engage German fighters if necessary. The tactical flexibility this represented was something that German air doctrine had never anticipated. A single American fighter group, equipped with P-47 seconds, could perform the functions that would have required multiple specialized German units: fighters for air superiority, dive bombers for precision strikes, and medium bombers for area bombardment. The specifications of the P-47 inches, its fighter-bomber configuration, revealed the extent of American engineering philosophy. The standard loadout that became common by mid-1944 consisted of two 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs on underwing pylons and one 500-pound bomb on a center-line rack. This 2,500-pound payload exceeded the bomb load of many dedicated German bombers. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, for comparison, carried a maximum bomb load of approximately 1,800 pounds, and doing so required it to fly without any defensive armament beyond a single rear-facing machine gun. The Dornier Du-17 medium bomber, a twin-engine aircraft with a crew of 4, carried a typical bomb load of 2,200 pounds. What made the P-47's capability truly remarkable was that this bomb load was external. The aircraft's internal fuel capacity of 305 gallons, combined with external drop tanks that could add another 300 gallons or more, meant that a P-47 could fly deep into enemy territory, deliver its ordnance, and still have sufficient fuel to patrol for targets of opportunity or engage in aerial combat before returning to base. German fighters, by contrast, had notoriously short range. The Bf-109G model, the most common variant in service by 1944, had an internal fuel capacity of 88 gallons and a combat radius of approximately 200 miles. Even with drop tanks, German fighters could not match the operational radius of the P-47. The technical explanation for this disparity lay in fundamental design choices made years earlier. German aircraft designers in the 1930s had optimized for performance in expected combat scenarios, short-range tactical missions supporting ground operations, where aircraft would take off from bases near the front lines, conduct their missions, and return quickly. This approach made sense given Germany's geographic position in Central Europe and its strategy of rapid conquest through blitzkrieg tactics. American designers, working with different assumptions about how air power would be employed, had prioritized range, payload, and survivability. The United States had no land borders with potential enemies and expected that any future conflict would require aircraft to operate over vast distances, either across oceans or deep into enemy territory. The P-47's engine represented the purest expression of this philosophy. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp was an engineering marvel, an 18-cylinder radial engine that displaced 2,800 cubic inches, approximately 46 liters. At takeoff power, it produced 2,300 horsepower. By comparison, the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine that powered the late-model Bf-109 produced approximately 1,800 horsepower from 35.5 liters. The American engine was not just more powerful in absolute terms, it was more powerful per liter of displacement, indicating a higher level of engineering refinement and manufacturing quality. This power allowed the P-47 to do something that violated every principle of German fighter design. It could carry enormous external loads without becoming helpless. When a Bf-109 carried a single 500-pound bomb, its maximum speed dropped from approximately 385 miles per hour to around 300 miles per hour, and its climb rate decreased precipitously. It became easy prey for Allied fighters. A P-47, carrying 5 times that bomb load, experienced performance degradation, certainly, but it retained a maximum speed of approximately 350 miles per hour and could still climb at a respectable rate. More importantly, the P-47 pilot could jettison the external stores in seconds if attacked, instantly restoring the aircraft to near full performance. German technical intelligence officers, examining captured P-47 seconds and interviewing captured American pilots, struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. The reports they filed described the aircraft in terms that revealed both admiration and incomprehension. They noted the massive engine, the robust construction, the redundant systems. They measured and documented everything: the thickness of the armor plating, the capacity of the fuel tanks, the rate of fire of the machine guns. But they seemed unable to grasp the broader implications of what they were documenting. In report after report, German analysts noted that the P-47 was overbuilt, that it used more materials and more manufacturing hours than necessary, that a more efficient design could achieve similar performance with less weight and less cost. What German analysts failed to understand, or perhaps refused to accept, was that efficiency was not the primary design criterion for American military aircraft. The United States possessed industrial capacity on a scale that dwarfed anything available to Germany. American aircraft factories in 1944 were producing approximately 8,000 aircraft per month, including fighters, bombers, and transport planes. German aircraft production in the same period, despite desperate efforts to increase output, peaked at around 3,000 aircraft per month. The United States could afford to build aircraft that were over-engineered, that used more materials than theoretically necessary, because it had virtually unlimited access to aluminum, steel, copper, and all the other raw materials required for aircraft production. This industrial disparity shaped not just the quantity, but the quality of American equipment. The P-47 was designed with the assumption that it would be manufactured in large numbers, maintained by mechanics with varying levels of skill, and flown by pilots who had received thorough but relatively short training periods. Everything about the aircraft reflected these assumptions. Its radial engine was air-cooled, eliminating the need for complex liquid cooling systems that could be damaged by a single bullet. Its controls were hydraulically boosted, making the massive aircraft easier to fly, even for relatively inexperienced pilots. Its weapons system consisted of 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, a standardized weapon used across all American military services, ensuring that ammunition and spare parts would always be available. German aircraft, by contrast, were designed with the assumption that they would be maintained by highly skilled technicians and flown by expertly trained pilots. The Bf-109's liquid-cooled inline engine produced excellent performance, but was vulnerable to damage and required careful maintenance. Its controls, lacking hydraulic boosting, became heavy and difficult to manage at high speeds. Its weapons suite often included a mix of machine guns and cannons of different calibers, maximizing theoretical firepower but creating logistics nightmares as ground crews struggled to keep track of multiple types of ammunition. These design choices had made sense when Germany had time to train pilots thoroughly, and when the Luftwaffe expected to fight short, decisive campaigns. By 1944, with pilot training time cut to a fraction of pre-war standards, and with the war grinding into its 5th year, these choices had become serious liabilities. Kesselring understood these implications with the clarity that comes from professional expertise. Before the war, he had overseen the expansion of the Luftwaffe, as it grew from a clandestine force to one of the most powerful air arms in the world. He had seen how German aircraft designers had created machines that were, in many ways, technically superior to their foreign equivalents. The Bf-109 had been faster and more heavily armed than the British Hurricane and Spitfire when it first entered service. The Ju-87 had been a revolutionary close air support platform, but he also understood that technical superiority in individual platforms meant nothing if you could not produce them in sufficient numbers, keep them supplied with fuel and ammunition, and replace your losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. The reports about the P-47's performance forced Kesselring to confront a truth that many German commanders had been avoiding. Germany was not losing the war because of temporary setbacks or bad luck. Germany was losing because it had entered a contest of industrial production against opponents who possessed vastly greater resources and who had organized those resources with ruthless efficiency. The American military-industrial complex had taken German innovations, the concept of the fighter-bomber, the tactics of close air support, the integration of air and ground operations, and had implemented them on a scale that German planners had never imagined possible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological impact of this realization on German military thinking cannot be overstated. For 5 years, German soldiers and officers had been sustained by the belief that they served a military machine that was qualitatively superior to anything the Allies could field. This belief had been cultivated deliberately through propaganda, but it was also rooted in real achievements. German tanks in 1939 and 1940 had outperformed French and British armour. German aircraft had swept the Luftwaffe's opponents from the skies over Poland, Norway, and France. German tactics had achieved victories that military theorists had considered impossible. The entire German self-conception as a military power rested on the assumption that German engineering, German training, and German fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. The P-47 Thunderbolt, mundane as it might seem compared to Germany's experimental jet fighters or rocket-powered interceptors, represented a more fundamental challenge to this worldview than any wonder weapon could have posed. It was not a revolutionary technology. It did not employ any innovations that German engineers could not have matched. It was simply a very good aircraft, built in enormous quantities, maintained by an efficient logistics system, and employed by pilots who had been trained in a systematic, almost industrial process. It represented the victory of systems thinking over individual brilliance, of mass production over craftsmanship, of industrial capacity over technical sophistication. The moment when Kesselring reportedly expressed his thoughts about the P-47 came during a meeting with his staff officers in mid-June 1944, shortly after the fall of Rome and the intensification of Allied air operations supporting the advance northward. According to accounts preserved in German military records and post-war memoirs, Kesselring was reviewing intelligence reports about American air operations when he made a comment that captured his understanding of the strategic situation. He observed that the Americans had solved a problem that German engineers had considered unsolvable: how to build an aircraft that could fight for air superiority and conduct ground attack missions without compromise in either role. And they had not solved it through some brilliant technical innovation, but through brute force engineering, building an engine so powerful and an airframe so robust that it could simply overpower the inherent compromises that other air forces had accepted as inevitable. The whispered comment, according to those present, was simpler and more bitter. Kesselring reportedly said that when he saw P-47 seconds carrying 2,500 pounds of bombs and still maintaining combat speed, he knew that Germany had already lost the war. Not because of any single battle or campaign, but because it revealed a fundamental disparity in industrial philosophy and national resources that no amount of tactical brilliance or operational skill could overcome. A nation that could afford to build fighters that were also bombers, that could mass-produce aircraft powerful enough to carry more ordnance than dedicated bombers while retaining fighter performance, possessed resources on a scale that Germany simply could not match. This realization was not unique to Kesselring. Throughout the German military hierarchy in mid to late 1944, commanders were confronting similar insights. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine, observed the vast fleets of American trucks and noted that the United States had motorized not just its combat units but its entire logistics tail, something Germany had never achieved. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, watched as American shipyards produced Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, demonstrating an industrial capacity that rendered the entire submarine campaign futile. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, preparing to defend France against the coming invasion, noted that German forces would face an enemy who could dedicate dozens of aircraft to attacking individual tanks or small troop formations, a level of air support that German forces had never enjoyed, even at the height of their success. But for Kesselring, fighting a defensive campaign in Italy where air power played a dominant role, the implications were more immediate and more personal. Every day, his forces endured attacks from P-47 seconds that struck with impunity. Every night, his staff officers compiled reports of destroyed vehicles, cratered roads, demolished bridges, and ammunition dumps set ablaze by fighter-bomber attacks. The cumulative effect of these raids was to paralyze German operations during daylight hours. Convoys could move only at night. Artillery positions had to be camouflaged with meticulous care. Command posts operated from cellars and caves. The German army in Italy, which had once been a mobile offensive force, had been reduced to a static defensive army that clung to prepared positions and hoped to inflict casualties severe enough to slow the Allied advance. The material statistics tell part of the story. Between January and August 1944, Allied air forces in Italy flew approximately 300,000 sorties. The 12th Air Force alone, which operated primarily in the fighter-bomber role using P-47 seconds and other aircraft, flew over 100,000 sorties during this period. These missions destroyed or damaged thousands of German vehicles, hundreds of artillery pieces, dozens of bridges, and countless supply dumps. But raw numbers cannot convey the psychological impact of living under constant air attack. German soldiers learned to recognize the sound of a P-47's engine, a deep, powerful roar produced by that massive radial. They learned to identify the whistle of falling bombs and the chatter of 50-caliber machine guns. They learned that the safest time to move was during bad weather, when Allied aircraft were grounded. The irony, from a historical perspective, is that German military planners had pioneered many of the tactical innovations that Allied forces were now using against them. The concept of close air support, of using aircraft to attack enemy ground forces in direct support of friendly troops, had been developed and refined by the Luftwaffe during the Spanish Civil War and the early years of World War II. The Ju-87 Stuka had become famous precisely because it provided responsive, accurate air support to German ground commanders. The Wehrmacht's success in Poland, France, and the early stages of Operation Barbarossa had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of combining air and ground operations in what the Germans called combined arms warfare. But the Germans had developed these tactics with certain assumptions that proved to be their undoing. They assumed that campaigns would be short, that victories would be achieved before industrial production became the decisive factor. They assumed that specialized aircraft, each optimized for a particular role, would be more effective than multi-role designs. They assumed that quality would triumph over quantity, that superior training and superior equipment could compensate for numerical disadvantages. And, perhaps most fatally, they assumed that their opponents would be unable or unwilling to match German innovation and operational skill. The P-47 Thunderbolt proved every one of these assumptions wrong. It was a multi-role aircraft that performed both fighter and bomber missions competently. It was produced in enormous quantities, with over 15,000 examples built before the end of the war. It was operated by pilots who received thorough but not exceptional training, men who learned to fly and fight in a matter of months rather than years. And it was deployed as part of an integrated military system that emphasized logistics, maintenance, and systematic planning over individual heroics or tactical brilliance. The afternoon of June 11th, 1944, the same day that began with Kesselring studying reconnaissance reports, ended with more attacks by P-47 seconds on German positions along the Gothic Line, the next major defensive position being prepared north of Rome. The attacks followed the pattern that had become routine. Groups of 8 to 12 Thunderbolts would appear, flying at low altitude to avoid early detection. They would identify their targets, supply trucks, artillery positions, troop concentrations, and attack with bombs and machine gun fire. The attacks lasted minutes, but their effects lasted for hours or days as German engineers worked to repair damaged roads. German medics treated the wounded, and German logistics officers struggled to reroute supplies around destroyed bridges. For the individual German soldiers who survived these attacks, the psychological impact was profound and lasting. They understood, with a clarity that transcended propaganda or official explanations, that they were fighting an enemy with resources so vast that individual German courage or tactical skill could not change the outcome. They saw American aircraft fill the skies in numbers that would have represented the entire German fighter force in a theater. They watched as P-47 seconds attacked not just major targets like bridges or rail yards, but individual vehicles and small troop formations, targets that German air forces would have considered too minor to waste precious fuel and ammunition attacking. This abundance of violence, delivered with casual efficiency by pilots who could afford to spend hours searching for targets, created a pervasive sense of helplessness. Kesselring's command of German forces in Italy would continue until March 1945, when he was transferred to the Western Front as Commander-in-Chief West. During those months, he demonstrated the tactical skill that had earned him his reputation as one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders. He conducted a fighting withdrawal that delayed the Allied advance, conducted counterattacks that inflicted significant casualties, and maintained a defensive line that prevented the Allies from breaking into the Po Valley until the final weeks of the war. But he did so with the knowledge that he was fighting a delaying action, not attempting to achieve victory. The goal was to tie down Allied forces in Italy, preventing them from being deployed elsewhere, while conserving German forces for the defense of the Reich itself. The broader implications of what Kesselring had observed about the P-47 extended far beyond the Italian theatre. Throughout the war, German military effectiveness had been premised on the belief that German forces could achieve local superiority through superior tactics, training, and equipment, and then exploit that superiority before enemy forces could recover. This approach had worked brilliantly in the early years of the war, when German forces had been fresh, well-equipped, and facing opponents who were unprepared or poorly led. But by 1944, the strategic situation had changed fundamentally. The Allies had learned from their defeats, had mobilized their industrial capacity, and had developed their own tactical doctrines based on systematic application of firepower rather than battlefield brilliance. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the weapon that won the war. No single weapon system ever is. But it represented something more significant than its individual capabilities. It represented a philosophy of warfare that prioritized sustainability over spectacular achievement, that valued reliability over peak performance, that accepted good enough as sufficient when good enough could be produced in vast quantities. This philosophy was anathema to German military thinking, which had always emphasized the decisive breakthrough, the bold stroke, the individual act of heroism or genius that would shatter enemy resistance. German military culture celebrated commanders like Erwin Rommel, who achieved stunning victories through audacity and improvisation, or Ernst Udet, the fighter ace turned aircraft procurement chief, who emphasized the performance of individual platforms over the boring work of logistics and mass production. American military culture, at least as it manifested in World War II, took a different approach. It emphasized planning, logistics, and systematic application of superior resources. American commanders were not necessarily more brilliant tactically than their German counterparts, but they had access to resources that allowed them to accept higher casualties, sustain longer campaigns, and overwhelm enemy defenses through sheer weight of firepower. The P-47 was the perfect embodiment of this approach. Not the best fighter in any single category, but good enough in all categories, and available in numbers that made German resistance ultimately futile. The post-war assessment of the P-47's impact varied depending on who was writing the history. American Air Force historians emphasized the aircraft's versatility and effectiveness, noting that it flew more combat sorties than any other American fighter type and delivered more ordnance than any other fighter bomber. British historians, somewhat more critically, noted that the P-47 consumed enormous resources and that lighter, more maneuverable fighters like the British Spitfire or the American P-51 Mustang might have been more efficient uses of industrial capacity. German historians, writing in the aftermath of total defeat, struggled to explain how the Luftwaffe, which had once dominated European skies, had been reduced to impotence. Some blamed Hitler for diverting resources to wonder weapons like jets and rockets instead of mass-producing proven designs. Others blamed poor strategic decisions, like the decision to continue bombing British cities instead of focusing on destroying the Royal Air Force. Few German historians were willing to confront the uncomfortable truth that Kesselring had recognized in June 1944, that Germany had been engaged in an industrial war that it could never win, regardless of tactical or operational decisions. The final irony of the P-47's story is that by the time Kesselring made his comment about the aircraft, the United States was already moving on to the next generation of fighter bombers. The P-47 Newtons, a long-range variant designed for operations in the Pacific, would have a combat radius exceeding 1,000 miles. Jets like the P-80 Shooting Star were in development and would enter service just as the war ended. The Americans, having developed a working formula for producing effective military aircraft, were scaling it up and applying new technologies to make it even more devastating. Germany, meanwhile, was increasingly relying on wonder weapons like the Me-262 jet fighter, which was fast and heavily armed but plagued by mechanical problems, fuel shortages, and a lack of trained pilots who could master its challenging flight characteristics. Kesselring surrendered to Allied forces on May 2, 1945, 1 week before the official end of the war in Europe. He was subsequently tried for war crimes related to reprisals against Italian civilians and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted. He spent several years in prison before being released in 1952 due to poor health. He died in 1960, having written his memoirs, and having served as an advisor to various post-war historical projects examining the German military experience in World War II. In his writings, he rarely mentioned the P-47 Thunderbolt specifically, but he repeatedly returned to the theme that Germany had lost the war because it had underestimated both the industrial capacity and the military competence of its opponents. The P-47 Thunderbolt remained in service with various air forces around the world until the 1950s. Many of the aircraft were sold as surplus after the war and found civilian uses as racing planes or were scrapped for their valuable materials. A handful were preserved in museums, where they remain today as reminders of a particular moment in the evolution of military aviation. Looking at a P-47 inches a museum, it's easy to see why German intelligence officers initially dismissed it. It is not elegant. It is not sleek. It looks exactly like what it is, a massively powerful engine wrapped in a functional airframe designed to do a job rather than to impress observers with technical sophistication. But that functional design, replicated 15,000 times over and deployed around the world, proved to be one of the most effective instruments of air power in history. It helped the Allies achieve air superiority in every theatre where it operated. It provided close air support that saved countless Allied soldiers' lives and destroyed German forces that might otherwise have prolonged the war. And perhaps most significantly, it represented a philosophy of warfare that would dominate military thinking for the rest of the 20th century. That industrial capacity, properly organized and effectively deployed, would ultimately defeat any opponent regardless of their tactical skill or technological sophistication. For Albert Kesselring, standing in his command post in June 1944, watching as American P-47 seconds delivered another day of attacks on his forces, the lesson was painfully clear. The war was lost not because German soldiers lacked courage, not because German commanders lacked skill, but because Germany had committed itself to a type of warfare that it lacked the resources to sustain. The P-47, carrying its impossible load of bombs and still maintaining combat speed, was not just an aircraft. It was proof of an industrial and organizational capacity that exceeded anything German planners had imagined when they launched the war 5 years earlier. In the face of such capacity, deployed with systematic efficiency, even the most brilliant defensive tactics could only delay the inevitable outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.